All right, guys. So, The View was discussing the Second Amendment and gun control, right? And for these ladies to opine on such topics, I find it very fascinating. Okay, because a lot of them really, I feel like, are not qualified to talk about the things they talk about, but they do it anyways. And one thing that Miss Sunny Holston said that had a lot of people turn their heads is that the Second Amendment was essentially designed to protect slavery. Like, that was the whole purpose of the Second Amendment, is to protect the institution of slavery. This is what she was arguing in reference to the Second Amendment and why black people are buying more guns, because gun ownership among black people is skyrocketing in this country. And I want you guys to hear what she was saying, and I'm going to talk more about what she stated and go from there.
Sonny, well, what do you think is at the heart of America's gun problem, Sonny?
Well, I think it's a cultural problem, and I think Anna is absolutely right. If you look at the history of the NRA, for decades, the NRA has pushed legislation that not only supported a lot of gun ownership and the proliferation of guns, but also stifled the study and spread of information, right, about the causes of gun violence. And when we talk about the culture of guns in this country, I'm reading an incredible book called The Second by Professor Carol Anderson. And she describes that the constitutional, the Second Amendment really was the right to bear arms was designed to protect slavery, right? Because they wanted, our founding fathers and others, they wanted to be able to empower a local militia group to basically put down slave revolts and protect plantation owners. And so because of the origins of the Second Amendment and because of the NRA, I think we're seeing this proliferation of guns and gun ownership. But I will say that gun ownership is on the rise, of course, in this country. But the biggest gun ownership on the rise is among the African Americans. It's up 58.2%. And in large part, when they are questioned, they're talking about white supremacy, they're talking about the pandemic, and they're talking about police violence. They want to be able to protect themselves. So this is not about a rise in crime in the streets. This is about people feeling unsafe. Black Americans.
Okay.
All right, guys. So as you can see there, Miss Sunny Holston basically made the argument that the Second Amendment was designed to protect slavery, right? And I want to address this because a lot of people are dismissing this idea off the cuff as ridiculous, right? And I just want to make it clear. The following article that I'm going to read for you guys from the Cumberland Times, based off of what Mr. Carl T. Bogus, who's a law professor, his argument that he's made about this, this is just where they get this from, right? That's all this is. I'm just reading this so that you guys understand the argument and why they're saying this. I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with it, okay? Because I think that it's obvious that the Second Amendment was not there just to protect the institution of slavery, but I think it would be a little bit disingenuous to act like southern states did not have an incentive to protect the institution of slavery, and that may or may not have influenced the wording of the Second Amendment. But that doesn't mean that was the purpose of the Second Amendment. So I am going to read this article, right, just so that we can learn about where these arguments come from, why they say the things that they say. And what this article is going to outline, guys, is the crafting of the Second Amendment between James Madison, who is basically accepted to be the father of the Constitution and a Federalist, and Mr. Patrick Henry and George Mason, who were also very influential founders around that time, right? And they were also anti-Federalists. So this article is going to talk about kind of the framing of the Second Amendment around their supposed disagreements. The ratification of the proposed Constitution of the United States hung in the balance. 8 states had ratified, 9 were needed. 4 states opposed, and Virginia held the deciding vote. The sticking point was Madison's original draft of the Second Amendment, which read, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free country, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, keep in mind, guys, this was James Madison's original draft, okay? Right? That was his original draft. For many slave owners, and the prominent men from Virginia making a ratification decision were slave owners. The idea of the militia being run by the federal government of a free country was anathema. If the feds controlled the military, that military could absorb slave patrols and lead to the end of the South's economy built on slavery. Okay, so essentially the argument here is that there are people in the South that felt like the Second Amendment, as written by Madison at first, basically gave the feds the power to basically take away or significantly restrict the state militia. Okay, so they had some issues with that because allegedly some of them were paranoid of slave rebellions, right? So let's read a little bit more here. Slaveholders control their slaves, who outnumbered whites across the South by large numbers, with armed militias that treated slaves with calculated brutality. Without militias, which virtually every white man between 18 and 45 had to participate in, the Southern police states would have collapsed. One researcher, Herbert Apteker, counted roughly 250 slave rebellions or conspiracies with 10 or more individuals by the time of the ratification decision. So fears of rebellion were not hypothetical. Law professor Carl T. Bogus opines that the militia remained the principal means of protecting the social order and preserving white control over an enormous black population. Anything that might weaken this system presents the gravest of threats. Now, this is what this law professor is arguing here. Patrick Henry, especially as well as George Mason, drummed up opposition to the Second Amendment by citing fears of slave rebellions. They saw the whole economic system of the South threatened if slave patrols were lost. Henry wrote, quote, in this situation, I see a great deal of property of the people of Virginia in jeopardy and their peace and tranquility gone. Whites being people, slaves being property. Bogus argues that Madison rewrote the Second Amendment to protect the slave militias that controlled the slaves by changing free country to free state. The Second Amendment, as now written, had everything to do with slavery and nothing to do with the right of an individual person to carry a weapon. Okay, so here's the thing, right? My problem with this is that I don't necessarily follow the end conclusion, right? The logic that just because James Madison, allegedly changed the Second Amendment, the language from free country to free state, that automatically means that, well, the Second Amendment was all about protecting the institution of slavery and had nothing to do with the individual's rights to bear arms. Now, again, this is a individual rights versus collectivist argument that people have been having for decades, okay? They've been having that for decades. And, recently the Supreme Court in District of Columbia versus Heller basically confirmed in 2008 that, it's about individual rights. But again, this has been something that's been debated, right? People will continue to debate this. He's basically using this to support the collectivist argument that the Second Amendment is about the right of the country to regulate itself as a militia, as a whole, not necessarily a individual's rights, right? And what he's saying is that, well, Madison changed that part from free country to ensure the southern states that, hey, you guys, can still keep your, militias, right? Your state militias, and that the federal government is not going to get rid of your militias, or that you're not going to be dependent on the federal government to stop a slave rebellion, right? Now, James Madison allegedly thought that these people were paranoid, right? In which he said, in response to Patrick Henry's concerns, he says, quote, I was struck with surprise when I heard him express himself alarmed with respect to the emancipation of slaves. Let me ask if they should even attempt it, if it will not be an usurpation of power. There is no power to warrant it. In that paper, the Constitution, if there be, I know it not. So basically saying, listen, the Constitution, in terms of how we're drafting it, really doesn't have anything to do with, weakening or really empowering the institution of slavery. But again, some of the anti-federalists like Patrick Henry thought otherwise. But James Madison saying that was not necessarily the intention. So in my opinion, I don't think that the original purpose of it had anything to really do with slavery. Now, whether or not it was tweaked to maintain slavery or to ensure, the South that, hey, we're not going to, come hit through and disrupt your militias, right? Hey, that could be possible, right? It 100% could be possible. And I wouldn't be surprised considering that there was concessions made between the North and the South in regards to our founding documents in the Constitution, purely because they wanted to maintain the Union. They wanted the states to ratify the Constitution to avoid basically some states falling back into the hands of Britain or going rogue, right? It was all about maintaining unity among the states. That's what it was about. Okay, so you got to make some compromises. History is not for the faint of heart, right? Things happen. But guys, like I said, in my opinion, when it comes to Second Amendment and the whole slavery thing, I think that the original intent of the Second Amendment was about the protection of the country from a foreign enemy, right? And from a tyrannical domestic government as well. And the details and the arguments were mainly about whether or not, Congress or the federal government should have the power to have, a standing army, and how much they should be able to regulate their own militias and arms and things like that. That's why I think what the original intent does. Could it have been tweaked to facilitate some slave owners to ensure that, okay, the feds are not going to come and take your slaves? Maybe, right? It's entirely possible. But I don't think that means that the Second Amendment exists purely to protect slavery. I think that argument is kind of silly. But, back to Sonny Hostin, the left, they love to say this stuff about the founders, to talk about how they own slaves and stuff like that, in order to try to make it so black people should feel ashamed of the founding of this country and that, these people were so bad and so terrible and everything is about the oppression of black people. And I'm like, bruh, no, that's not necessarily it. History is complex, right? Okay, yes, the founders did some things to protect the institution of slavery. It is what it is. I personally don't give a damn, right? It is what it is. I just find this stuff fascinating. But I think that what really bothers me more than what she claimed about the Second Amendment is the fact that, one, she ignores, the laws after that, right? The anti-Second Amendment laws that actually were there to keep black people from owning guns and protecting and defending themselves, right? Done by the Southern Democrats for the most part. Okay, she ignores that part, right? The Democrats don't like to talk about that history, right? Of gun control being racist. They don't want to talk about that, right? But she goes on to talk about why black people are buying more guns, and she basically makes the argument that it's because of white supremacy, the pandemic, and police, right? It has nothing to do with rising crime. It has nothing to do with that. And I've read a few articles on this that basically are saying the same things as she's saying, but quite honestly, guys, I really don't buy it. I think in general, more people are buying more guns, particularly because the Democrats are always going out here threatening people in regards to taking away their guns. Also, on top of that, the race riots that we saw last year, right? So if black people are buying guns because of so-called white supremacy, it's because the left has put up this threat, and most of it being imaginary, of white supremacy that may have motivated some black people to go buy guns. But it's not because there's actually a real existing threat of white supremacy that black people need to worry about. Again, statistically speaking, black people need to worry about other black people, right, and protect themselves from other black people than they do a white person, right, or some type of white supremacist. Those are just the facts, okay? Those are just the facts. Now, when it comes to the pandemic thing, I can kind of see that argument, right? Like, last year when, people were fighting over toilet paper, stuff like that. I can see how people can think that resources become really scarce and they may, become armed, right? Just in case there's some fight for resources. I get that, right? I get certain paranoia about that. And when it comes to the whole police thing, again, that's 100% a construction from the Democrats, right? The fear mongering that the Democrats have done in regards to black people, how they should be afraid of the police, that the police are slave catchers, right? Stemming from, the founder of this country and stuff like that. All that type of fear mongering, right? If black people are buying guns because of that, right? In reference to the police. Again, that comes from the Democrats, not because of anything that the police are doing themselves. Okay? And I also think that it would be stupid to act like rising crime is not a contributing factor to people buying more guns, especially, again, with the Democrats talking about defunding the police every, few days. Okay? Some progressive comes out and says how much they need to defund the police. I can imagine that people will probably think they need to arm themselves. That's what I think is going on here. So with that being said, I think that last part that Sonny Hostin was talking about is bogus. I think black people buy more guns mainly because of threats from the Democrats and threats that Democrats have created in regards to black people being under some type of assault from white supremacy or whatever, right? Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a black conservative perspective. Peace.